Thank you all for coming. I think this may be the first time we've had an overflow capacity here in this room. I apologize for those of you who don't have seats at this point. I think we're basically out of space. But it's wonderful to see so many people who've come out here today for this amazing panel. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm a professor of politics here at NYU and the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. I wanted to let everybody know today's talk is part of what we are calling the New York City Russia Public Policy Series, which is a series that's a joint collaboration of the NYU Jordan Center here at NYU, as well as the Harriman Institute at Columbia, and is being put on with a generous financial contribution from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And the New York City Russia Public Policy Series will be having at least one event at each campus, so one at NYU, one at Columbia, each semester. And so we just had one at Columbia last week on prospects for U.S.-Russian cooperation on Afghanistan. We've got at least two planned for the spring, maybe more. So if you're interested today, keep an eye on the series. We'll continue on your way out. If you're not already on our email list, sign up on our email list and you'll get notifications about this series in the future. Also, given the topic of today, I want to take this chance to note to this crowd in particular that on November 8th, note the date, we will have a conference here that is jointly sponsored by the NYU Jordan Center, as well as PONARS, which is a collection of scholars who work on studying issues related to Russia and post-Soviet affairs and post-Soviet security affairs on the one-year anniversary of the US presidential elections, looking at U.S.-Russian relations and U.S. relations with the West. We have 15 scholars, approximately, I think even more than half, coming from the region, and we'll have a full day of panels on U.S.-Russian relations a year out after the election. So that's on November 8th, taking place here at the Jordan Center in this room. The other thing I just want to draw your attention to is that, like many other Russia centers, we are having anniversary events for the 1917 revolution, and what we've been doing is having a lecture series. And so we've had 2 lectures already in the series, but the lectures are on 100 years since 1917, being given by historians, and the next event in that will be November 15th, given by NYU's Ann O'Donnell, who will be speaking then. The final thing I want to say before introducing our panel is just to let you know that we are live streaming this and it's being recorded, so everything that is here is considered in public and in the public domain that's being said here. But also, I want to take this opportunity, we've set up a new program where we've invited liberal arts colleges in particular that might not have as much Russia-related programming as we have here at NYU to join us. And we have students and faculty at a number of colleges that are watching on the live stream today and gathered to watch this event as well. So we may try and take questions from them. We're still working out the technological aspects of it, but we're hoping to be doing that over the course of today. So then, with all that being said, again, welcome to all of you. And it is my great, great pleasure to welcome this incredible panel that we have here today to talk to us about Russia and the 2016 U.S. elections. So to my left is Timothy Frye, the Marshall Shulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy and Chair of the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. Tim is also the Research Director of the International Center for the Study of Institution and Development at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and the editor of Post-Soviet Affairs. His most recent book is Property Rights and Property Wrongs. Okay, anyway, he does lots of interesting stuff. Sitting next to him is Julia Yaffe, the staff writer at The Atlantic, covering politics and international affairs. She was a Moscow-based correspondent for foreign policy in The New Yorker from 2009 to 2012 and can obviously teach us about writing concise bios. We're very pleased to have her here today. Next to her, on her left, is Andrei Soldatov, a Russian investigative journalist and co-founder and editor of Agentura.ru, a watchdog of the Russian Secret Service's activities. He and Irina Borogin, who's also here today with us, are the co-authors of The Red Web, The Struggle Between Russia's Digital Dictators and the New Online Revolutionaries, that was published in 2015, but the new edition now has a chapter on the theme of today's panel, Russia's activities in the 2016 U.S. elections. And then finally on the left is Seba Gunitsky, who's going to start us off, who is an associate professor with tenure, may I add now,
as a freeman.
At the University of Toronto, Political Science University of Toronto. And he has, and his most recent book is Aftershocks, Great Powers and Domestic Reforms in the 20th Century, which was recently published by Princeton University Press. So Seba's going to kick us off, and the plan for this afternoon is each of the panelists is going to talk for about 10 minutes in a kind of opening statement. I'll then direct a little bit of discussion between them, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. So, Seba?
Great. Thank you, Josh. Can people in the back hear me okay? There's no microphone. Just let me know if I start fading out. And I definitely won't take more than 15, and if in fact, Josh, if I start approaching 15.
Okay, yeah.
Well, given that this is very much an ongoing story, and in some ways sort of a painfully ongoing story, I wanted to take a step back from any of the latest revelations. We see new minutiae revealed almost every day, and I want to take a look at the big picture in the next 2 minutes when it comes to the Trump-Russia story. And there's been obviously a lot of speculation about the nature of the collusion and the nature of Russian interference, most recently about Russia's use of Facebook and Twitter, all the things that I'm sure you're familiar with. And in that speculation, the role of the Russian intelligence services and the role of Putin in particular has been especially prominent. Not surprising given how large of a role Putin plays in our imagination, at least if not in Russian politics. But what I would argue in the next couple minutes is that if you want to get at the roots of the collusion, you have to look at where Trump's links with Russia actually start. And they do not start with Putin, certainly. And they certainly don't start with the 2016 elections, Facebook ads or no Facebook ads. They start with lots and lots of Russian oligarch money pouring into Trump's real estate businesses and casino businesses, starting in the 1990s and even earlier. And this activity started well before Trump had any serious political ambitions. And many of these people, let's see if this thing actually works. Many of these people Trump has been working with for many years. People like Felix Ater, some of you may know, who's a wealthy Russian businessman with a criminal past. Or people like Aras Agalarov, here with his son, whose business partner, Ike Kavaladze, was in the now infamous meeting with Don Jr. Last summer. So these are people that precede all the hullabaloo in a way that we've been discussing over the past year. And it may seem counterintuitive, although it probably won't be to any of the people on this panel. To understand the roots of the collusion, we have to set Putin aside, I think, at least in part, and follow the money. Trump's linkages with Russia, beginning with these ties forged in the 1990s and below. And we're not talking about small amounts, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars here, possibly enough to keep Trump out of another bankruptcy in the late 90s when nobody else was willing to lend the money. No other banks except Deutsche Bank, and we know how that turned out. So how do we know that it's large amounts? Because they told us. Because Donald Trump Jr. said in 2008, almost 10 years ago, Russians make up a disproportionate number of our investors. We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia. So Trump's financial ties are not speculation at this point. But why did Trump become such a focal point for Russian money? If we're trying to get at the roots of this collusion, why Trump? Well, I think it's because Russian oligarchs knew they could do business with Trump without too much hassle. When Trump Tower was built in the mid-1980s, it was only the second high-rise in New York that would actually accept anonymous buyers. And still, to this day, Trump's businesses are privately held. They don't have many reporting requirements, which is great for the kind of people who wanted to get money out of Russia in the 90s and 2000s and today. And we've certainly seen that he's willing to bend the rules when it comes to his own financial conflicts as president. But this is nothing new. This is a trend that goes back decades and can be discerned in his dealings with these wealthy Russians. And if thinking about the Trump-Russia story through the prism of financial ties seems like another layer of complication, seems like adding another layer to this already tangled story, I would say money is the great simplifier in this case. It simplifies people's motives and it simplifies their constraints. And it makes inconsistent people like Trump, who's been inconsistent about just about everything else, consistent about Russia. One thing he has been consistent about besides Russia is making money, and I think those two are related. If you're wondering why Trump has been so consistent on Russia and not everything else, I think his financial ties, the long-standing financial ties, might be the answer. And if you're wondering why he's been so reluctant to release his taxes, these long-standing financial ties might be the answer. And as far as I can tell, it's actually the simpler answer rather than the big conspiracy. And again, that's not to minimize Putin's role. He's not some innocent bystander here by any means. Only to say that the collusion probably began for reasons that have little to do with Putin or the Kremlin directly. And I think this points to a larger problem with the Putin-Russia story, at least the way it's covered in the Western media to some extent. And that is treating Russia as a single monolithic entity, with Putin in the middle as this fat, malicious spider sitting in the middle of the web with his tentacles reaching out to every corner of Russia. And of course, I think this view is partly inescapable because he makes such a great villain. If you want an antagonist for the story, I mean, honestly, Hollywood screenwriters couldn't have done it better. He's basically an eye patch away from a Bond villain at this point, at least in the public imagination, which in a way suits him because it overinflates its importance in Russia. So Putin will remain at the center of the story. I think that's okay. But of course, Putin does not rule by himself, and it's very easy to forget that when we read the coverage of Russian foreign policy in the U.S. He's not this mastermind with his finger on the pulse of every important Russian in the country. And the Russian government is not this shadowy monolith. Again, this will not be news to any of the Russia experts here. The Russian government is messy and disorganized, what the journalist Mark Galeotti called the adhocracy. Right? Things get done on an ad hoc basis. It's not the smoothly running machine that we sometimes think about. And Putin has people that he needs to keep happy as well, especially after 17 years of rule. People are getting a bit itchy. These are people who are bothered by sanctions and have been working hard to roll back the economic treatment of Russia, what they see as the poor economic treatment of Russia by the US. So I think we need to decenter Putin from the story and break up the box that we call Russia, because there's really a multiplicity of actors involved. Oh, here we go. I try to avoid professorial bullet points, so I'll just a few. So when we read about Russian interference, we have to keep in mind what exactly do we mean. There's a multiplicity of interests at work, and some of those interests do overlap with the Kremlin, but some do not. Some are very distinct. The people who met with Don Jr. and Manafort last summer were motivated, it seems, primarily by ensuring favorable economic treatment of Russia. That is, getting rid of sanctions, canceling the Magnitsky Act, settling the Prevazan case. We hear all the time that the story is to disrupt American democracy, and that's part of it, of course. But the people that were in that room with Don Jr. did not care very much about disrupting democracy. In fact, for them, disrupting democracy is probably bad for business. The people who set up that meeting cared really about normalizing relations between Russia and the US, not disturbing them. And the Russian lawyer who set up the meeting, Natalia Veselnitskaya, later wrote on her Facebook page that this is the beginning of the end of the new Cold War. In other words, she wants to normalize relations, it seems to me. So that's one set of interests, but of course there's other actors involved, the security services, the Russian security services, which may have their own motivations, which may not be economic in nature, and whose goal may indeed be to disrupt the US political process. And here's, we get all this psychobiography, I guess would be the term, of Putin's motivation as revenge, getting back at Hillary, what he sees as sort of a personal affront by Hillary Clinton in helping to stage the 2012 protests and releasing the Pentagon Papers. We can speculate about how much Putin is motivated by these ideas, but I do want to stress that that's part of the motivation here, and only one part. The people in the Don Jr. meeting probably had somewhat different motivations. They want sanctions lifted. They don't care about political intrigue, even though this political intrigue has become such a major part of the story. And even within the security apparatus, I think it's a mistake to assume that Putin controls everything directly. When he talks about so-called patriotic hackers, this is what Trump talked about when he talked about 400-pound guys in New Jersey. This is what Putin is talking about. He's talking about patriotic hackers, people who are private agents who may be acting on behalf of Kremlin, but without having direct links to the Kremlin. So it's not clear how much control Putin has, but what all this means, again, is that Putin is not the mastermind that we assume him to be, and may not even be the main antagonist of this story. And the disrupting American democracy story, which has been very important, may not be the original goal, at least not when it comes to understanding the collusion. When the author and the journalist Yulia Latynina left the country recently, fearing for her life, she said that she left the country not because she was afraid of Putin or because Putin controls everything, but precisely because Putin cannot control certain things, such as the threats on her life. So again, it's important to keep Putin's role in its proper context. And I think this is useful not just for understanding this particular element of Russian foreign policy, the interference, but Russian foreign policy more general. We often associate Russian foreign policy with Putin's foreign policy, as if it's really an extension of his personal pathologies. And I think that's partly, too simplistic. You don't want to reduce a country's foreign policy to the pathologies of one of its leaders or its single leader. Because I think there are geopolitical considerations that Russia has here that transcend Putin in a way and go beyond him. And that's why those problems are rooted not just in Putin or whatever the autocratic institutions are in place, but something that resides deeper in the geopolitical conflict between the two. Namely, Russia's two goals, which are primacy in its immediate neighborhood. Now, in practice, that means territorial control, but it doesn't have to. And that's one element that it's pursuing. And two is державность, with other great powers. Державность meaning, it's a hard term to translate, great powerness, or the state of being recognized as a great power. And those are two motivations of Russian foreign policy that I think transcend Putin and point to deeper sources of potential problems in the US-Russian relationship. And again, that's a useful part of decentering Putin and seeing the nature of the relationship. And one final thing I would add is, in terms of where this is going, I don't want to speculate too much about impeachment because so much depends on variables that we just don't know at the moment, including who will control the House after the midterms. But one thing I will say is that one predictable long-term consequence that I see emerging out of this is the increasing taming of the internet, the increasing territorialization of the internet. Over the past decade or so, autocratic governments have moved through sort of a three-step dance with social media. One was, the initial stage was control, where social media is seen as an obstacle to autocratic rule. And this is when autocratic strategies are all about blocking and censoring social media. But pretty soon, autocrats are smart, and pretty soon they figured out how to co-opt social media for their own purposes, how to use it to shape discourse inside the country, how to use it to find out information about people's grievances. And what we're seeing now, just over the last 3 or 4 years, is the movement into the third stage, which is mobilization, where we see social media being used as a tool of foreign policy, not just as a defensive mechanism, not just as a tool to shore up the regime internally, but actually as a tool of foreign policy to be used abroad. And given that, I think we'll see a lot more pushback from countries like the US to control access to online media. We're already seeing some of this in Russia and China, but unfortunately we're going to be seeing more control over the internet, I think, as a result of Russia's campaign in the US. And the era of free global internet, if it ever existed, is now over. I'm curious if you agree. And Russia helped to kill it. And so regardless of what happens with the impeachment, we've already paid a heavy price for Russia's interference. So I'm afraid I'll have to end on that pessimistic note, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks very much, though. Andre?
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. So we had our book about the Russian internet published in 2015, and back then our main conclusion was that the Kremlin's attempts to put the internet inside of the country under control largely failed for many reasons. Part of them technical, part of them because they just didn't know how to deal with horizontal nature of the network. And of course, well, there have been some developments since then, and notably the US election and the Russian meddling. And that's why we faced with this question of, well, how it could be possible that the Kremlin, understanding apparently so little about how to control the things online inside of his country, well, found a way to use the internet outside of the country, in the country where actually the internet has been born and developed. And we tried to answer some questions in our new chapter, and one of them was obviously, and maybe the most important, is whether we are dealing with some strategy all along, like from the beginning, to try to promote Trump and to harm Hillary Clinton, or we are dealing with some sort of tactical move prompted by something which happened around April. And well, the answer for us was, given all the information we have and gathered back in Moscow, was actually it was a tactical decision. It was a very emotional decision, and mostly it was a kind of reaction to the Panama Papers investigation. It was one of the biggest journalistic cooperation effort, and lots of journalists were involved, including people in Moscow. Some of them working for Novaya Gazeta. And the biggest story for Russia was, of course, about Sergei Raldugin, a cellist, and happens to be personal friends of Vladimir Putin. The interesting thing was that, well, the normal tactics for the Kremlin, if they are dealing with some sensitive story, is never to comment on this story, just to have, well, to let the story die. In this case, the Kremlin started commenting on this story even before it was published. Because journalists, obviously, they sent some requests for comments, and we got immediately the reaction from Dmitry Peskov, and very soon we got the reaction from Vladimir Putin. And it was absolutely clear that he personally felt offended. He personally, well, tried to defend his friend, and he also made some strange remark, which possibly could shed some light on why we got the whole of this crisis. And the problem was that by the beginning of April, the second group of Russian hackers were already in the system of John Podesta. And probably you remember that the biggest expose, later published by WikiLeaks, was about Podesta emails and about some paid speeches made by, given by Hillary Clinton at Goldman Sachs. So it looks like Putin was briefed about these findings, and he made a strange remark. He said that actually Panama Papers were published in a newspaper funded by and owned by Goldman Sachs. And back then, nobody actually understood why he believed that some German newspaper actually, well, funded by Goldman Sachs, and why it matters. But it looks like now, given all this information we have from 2016, probably it was a kind of intelligence miscalculation. So he was given a picture, Putin, that actually he was dealing with a big conspiracy of Goldman Sachs, Hillary Clinton and her people behind Panama Papers and an attack on his personal friend. And of course, in this situation, he felt kind of justified trying to fight back, and we tried to identify some events, probably meetings, where the decision about a retaliation could be taken. And our guess is, educated guess, is that there was a meeting at the Security Council in the Kremlin, and 8 people gathered, most of them with security services background, with some experience in the KGB, and probably it was that meeting where the decision to fight back was taken. And 2 weeks later, we got dcleaks.com registered, and that was a moment when it became absolutely clear that there is a new idea how to use all these emails stolen by hackers. The new idea is to weaponize this information. We also tried to understand what actually was the goal of all this information campaign. And it looks like in the beginning, the idea was not to promote Trump, but rather to harm Hillary Clinton. It was very personal for Vladimir Putin. It was very personal for some people in the Kremlin, especially at the Security Council. And actually, these people are, well, because of this background of the KGB, it means that most of them do not only say promote Russian propaganda, they sometimes believe in this propaganda, specifically in all these conspiracy theories. Because we do not believe in the idea of election in Russia, it means that we do not believe in the elections anywhere, including the United States. We actually believe that many things are already pre-decided about the US election, that Hillary Clinton is destined to be the next president. Because it's all decided by the establishment of the elites, so the only thing which could be possibly done is to try to inflict some damage, to try to make her weak. And that could be solved under the pretext of helping to lift the sanctions. But I do not believe that actually there was any real rational element in it. It was a very emotional decision from the beginning, and probably by it was very emotional until maybe August. And of course, the biggest problem here for all of us, for all journalists writing about hackers in Russia, is which organization, what kind of agency was behind these operations. And it's the most interesting question to ask, because actually, unfortunately, Russia is not like China, and we are dealing, of course, we have some very powerful security services and intelligence agencies, but at the same time, we have lots of so-called informal actors. We have people who are officially not part of any government structure. And sometimes you have very surprising people coming to the Kremlin and promoting some ideas from, say, annexation of Crimea to, rapprochement with China in cyberspace. And these ideas might be promoted by people who have nothing to do with the government. They just happen to be very close to some people at the administration of the president and be in the right time and the right place. And the problem was with the hacking community probably from the very beginning, from 1999, that historically Russian security services, which should be in charge of cyber, were extremely slow at reacting to new emerging threats. It started with the Chechen websites during the Second Chechen War, and actually it was the case for many, many years. And the response we got was that informal actors, we can call them patriotic hackers, we might call them hackers working for pro-Kremlin youth movements, we can call them IT companies which were forced into close cooperation with the Russian security services. We are dealing with this list of people.
So
They,
could you just speak slightly slower?
Yeah,
Just like
excuse
one
me.
night oldest. A little louder.
sorry.
That's okay.
So the problem with
Yes, a little louder.
okay, I will try to
We
speak.
want to hear you, but it's going really fast.
That might be easier.
Okay.
Or no?
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
better,
just
okay.
a little slower.
Okay, the problem is that it's extremely difficult to understand in this complicated world of informal and formal actors who were finally in charge of this operation. What we possibly need to remember is that many things changed in relationship between businesses, hacker communities, IT industry, and say the Kremlin after the annexation of Crimea. Before the annexation of Crimea, this kind of relationship mostly benefited the businesses. So if you want to do something with, well, in Moscow, you need to know some people in high positions. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you actually work for the government. That completely changed after 2014. That was the moment that Putin actually made absolutely clear that now it's time to serve the government. And he sent this message not only to big companies, oil companies, metallurgical companies, all kind of industries, but it also sent this message to IT companies. And that was the moment we started identifying, well, people in the IT industry, well, in a position that they hardly could say no if approached by the government. So that's why now we have not only security services or intelligence agencies, and not only criminal hackers, but we also should remember about Russian IT companies well, involved in this kind of activities.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Andre.
So, I agree with everything these guys said. I just want to pull back a little bit and talk about possible motives that Putin, in addition to the release of the Panama Papers, which were hugely embarrassing for Russia, and you had this weird comment from Dmitry Peskov.
A little louder, please. Yes, please.
In addition to the release of the Panama Papers, which triggered this very strange comment from Dmitry Peskov, where he said the release of the Panama Papers was basically the CIA and the State Department trying to meddle in the upcoming parliamentary elections in Russia in September 2016, which in some way is kind of drawing a line between the financial privacy of Russian leaders and the sovereignty of Russian elections, which I found to be strange. But if you kind of pull back and you think about where Russia is, you have in a couple weeks the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which was essentially a year-long collapse of the Romanov state. And last December we had the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you have Vladimir Putin existing between these two very ambiguous milestones and constantly surrounded by talk of potential collapse. So both in the, and I just want to say, by the way, in outlining these motives, I don't necessarily agree that everything I say is true. I think this might be the kind of how Russians see it or how Putin might see it. So just that caveat. There's this idea of the kind of both the strength and the fragility of the Russian state, and I think that the interplay between those two is very important, especially when you have the Russian opposition constantly eagerly awaiting the collapse of your state. You know, any hiccup in oil prices, any drop in the ruble, any disappearance for 10 days, or any dump of the Panama Papers, you're basically a week away from the regime collapsing, or 5,000 people come out on the streets of Moscow. And you have it mirrored in the West as well, and in Washington, and this kind of every time there's a protest in Moscow, American kind of very casual observers will say, oh wow, does this mean they're about to push Putin out, or he's almost, this is it, this is the final gasp for him. And I think Russians know and feel this. Then keep in mind, I mean, the other big anniversary this year is, or was, Putin's 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference, which is pretty much the only kind of geopolitical document of ideology, I guess, ideological blueprint for post-Soviet Russia. And it was very much a reaction to the Bush presidency and saying, look, we know we lost the Cold War. You think we lost the Cold War, and you think that the paradigm that's set up, that the Western liberal order is the best order and the most moral, most efficient way to govern people, and that the Russian, the Soviet way is not. But we'd like to renegotiate the terms of surrender. And this unipolar world that we emerged with in 1991, before you had, for lack of a better term, a bipolar world, you had this constant tension. He says in the speech that basically you had the Moscow and Washington, and the tension between them was what provided security for the world, which is strange given the amount of proxy wars happening through the Cold War. Anyway, so then he says we emerged with this unipolar world, and all it has given us is bloodshed and chaos, because the U.S. just goes into places willy-nilly, determining who rules a country, right? This was in response to his warnings being ignored in 2003 before the invasion of Iraq and the UN Security Council, where he has a veto, being bypassed. And if you look at where Putin is in 2016, he has watched Saddam Hussein being executed. He has watched this video over and over again. He has watched his old ally Muammar Gaddafi being lynched over and over again. He's convinced, because these guys really are conspiracy theorists par excellence. He has seen Victoria Nuland personally topple Viktor Yanukovych in Kiev. And this on top of the string of color revolutions that had already swept through the post-Soviet space, the so-called Mir abroad in Georgia, then Ukraine, then Kyrgyzstan. And it's one of the reasons that in 2015 Putin goes into Syria, and with the kind of understanding that he was drawing his own red line in Syria, that regime change, US-sponsored regime change, basically stops here, not one more. And I think that after the Panama Papers, after Ukraine, which he saw as, he saw the Euromaidan as driven by the West, the feeling was not one more, and they're probably coming for me, and I want to show that there is more than one regime change racket in town. That you guys meddle in elections all the time, all your NGOs and your National Endowments for Democracy and your, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, we can do the same thing too. And we can give as good as we get. So that speaks to motive. Also, I wanted to speak a little bit about the implementation, which I think is very interesting, given how it's portrayed in the U.S. press. I think until basically until last week, and until your book was updated, most of the news about how, and the investigations about how the election was hacked here in the U.S., all of it was coming from American journalists with no experience in, who are fantastic journalists but have no experience in Russia, and see Putin generally as this fat spider sitting in this spider web, controlling everything, micromanaging everything, making every tiny call, which is not true, right? Generally, the way decisions are made is Putin gives some kind of a signal, whether it might be very specific, it might be very vague, like, let's keep that bitch from winning the presidency or something, and the people below him interpret it as they will and implement it as they will, kind of trickling down this big bureaucratic pyramid with many tentacles. It's a terrible metaphor, but it's a pyramid with tentacles, and they're all fighting. And, and part of the reason for that is that it provides Putin plausible deniability. He can come out and say, without technically lying, that he doesn't know. It could be patriotic hackers who just got up and were moved by the spirit to, hack the DNC. Because he technically may not have ordered them to specifically do that. he might not even know that the DNC has servers or what the DNC even is. So that built-in deniability we also saw during the invasion of Crimea is very important for the kind of geopolitical and also the domestic game he plays. The other thing that emerged this last week, which I think was a big game changer, we finally had some really good reporting coming out of Moscow. First with a troll codenamed Maxim, who spoke to TV Rain about how the troll factory in St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency, worked and the kind of work he personally did. And then you had this very long, very detailed, excellent investigation from RBC about the troll factory and how it worked. And what I thought was so interesting about it was that you had that the Internet Research Agency was mostly staffed by students at St. Petersburg State University. So these are the students at the best university in Russia's second capital, who are students in journalism, linguistics, foreign policy, and Middle Eastern studies. So these are kind of the elite of the humanities, right? And these are, in some ways, the people we fetishize here in the West as the natural anti-Putin contingent, that these are the people who are going to come out and topple him. For now, though, they seem to be working like, it's amazing how you heard, for example, John Brennan say this at a hearing in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee this winter, or in March, 17 years ago, I don't know, time has completely collapsed under this presidency. He said that this was basically a shoestring budget. It was something like 200 million, which for Russia is a lot of money. This troll factory had a budget of about $1 million last year. And yet these students at the very bottom rank were making 2.5 times the average salary that a Russian makes these days, right? So given the sinking average Russian salary, the very low ruble, these kids were making bank, but it was still very cheap for the Russian state. The other thing is that these kids spoke English. They used VPNs to watch American shows, like a lot of the Russian student elite do, but they were then weaponizing this information, watching House of Cards, watching Russian shows, using VPNs, then using the VPNs and the knowledge they gained in the shows to, and the access the VPNs offered them to basically the Western media and Western culture, and then weaponizing that knowledge against us, which I think is very interesting. And the last thing is that what we should not lose sight of as we dig into this, and we'll continue to dig into this, is the role that we played. The Russians, of course, the Russians are going to try to do nefarious things. They're the Russians, right? But the question is, they did not create Donald Trump. They did not create Breitbart News. They did not create the dearly departed Roger Ailes, and the work he did at Fox News for decades, undermining the very idea of facts and truth and objectivity. They did not create police brutality and a racist backlash to the first black president. They did not create any of these things. And I still don't think that, that they made 60-some million Americans vote for somebody who, bragged about sexually assaulting women and then had to, and the gazillion things he did in 2016 that people were like, okay, that's still better than Hillary Clinton. So we have to think about our own role in this and the extent to which we were, the tensions that exist in our society, that it was so easy for the Russians to come in and amplify and stoke.
Okay, thanks so much, Julie. Tim?
Great, thanks a lot. It's really been a terrific panel. I think it's such a complex story that we can all approach it from different angles. Unfortunately, Josh asked me to interject some political science here, and before you run for the exits, there is some interesting stuff here, I promise. I want to talk about what I call the two overstatements and one understatement. And one is, First, I think there's a tendency among casual observers in the media and of Russia is that to really overstate the effectiveness of Russia's efforts during the election. You know, we often hear these points. It was the Kremlin that put Trump in the White House, or the votes played a pivotal role, or look, they were micro-targeting in Wisconsin and Michigan, as if this was a secret that these were important states, or at some minimum saying that Trump was aided by Russian interference. But when I kind of put my political science hat on, one thing is it's really hard to persuade people. It's really hard to change people's minds. And I think there's a sense out there that, oh my God, there were these tweets out there were these Facebook pages, people saw them. Oh my God, there's a race problem in the U.S. I can't believe this. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump, right? Voters receive lots and lots of messages, right? They self-select into the media that they view. So the people who are seeing the Black Matters instead of Black Lives Matters webpage are the same people who are seeing Breitbart or seeing InfoWars and the like. Partisanship is this incredibly powerful drug. If people view news and facts through partisan lenses, and it's very difficult to get partisans to change their views. And even if we think about the hacking of the DNC material, let's remember, even after that material had been out there, Clinton was still in the lead, right? Even factoring in that into account. The Comey letter, which is, I think, one of these rare cases in political science where we can say, hey, look, here's an event that may have really shaped the dynamics of a campaign, because campaigns are these big, noisy things. But the Comey letter was really distinct in that way. But remember, that wasn't about the hacking. That was about the investigation into the private server and our beloved Anthony Weiner. What a cast of characters in this story. Anthony Weiner, Scaramucci, Roger Ailes. So it's just very difficult, I think, to persuade people, particularly with Facebook ads. The other thing that political science research and social psychology research more generally tells us is that misinformation is something that people remember. Right? There's this great book called Made to Stick. And it starts off with this urban legend of the guy, he goes to the bar, he meets the girl, they have a drink, they go back to his room. In the morning, he wakes up and he's got a bandage on his appendix and a note pinned to his chest that says, your appendix has been removed, call the hospital, right? So have people heard this urban legend before or no? This is news to people? Oh, they start the book with this story, right? But this is the kind of story that you remember, all these urban legends because they have these very vivid details, right? But we don't remember the things that, we need to remember, like when you're studying for a test, right? Or when you're, trying to come up with a talk like this, we often forget what we're trying to say. So people remember this misinformation often because it's very colorful and it's very vivid. And sometimes it's even credible. For most people, they can sort out the misinformation from the real information. But for the small percentage of people who fall for this, it's really hard to get them to change their views. And the only way to do that is to really engage the reader, get them to question the premise of the story, and to provide a counter-narrative that provides some new information, right? So all the things that don't happen in most of our mass media. And I know that this works because in another time and in another place, I was an information warrior. I was involved in the original information wars in the 1980s. For 15 months, I traveled the Soviet Union with the U.S. Information Agency. It was the best job I'll ever have. And I stood there with a microphone and answered questions about life in the United States. So we got questions about Star Wars, about Reagan, Middle East policy, all these different. Was Michael Jackson popular? All these really weighty topics. And we could talk about racism. That was a really hard one. Made very little progress. We could talk about Social Security and unemployment and how that all worked. But what really got the point across to people was when we argued amongst ourselves. Here we are, these representatives of the U.S. government going over to talk about, whatever, life in the United States, and we were willing to criticize each other and to argue with each other and to say, that no, I hadn't voted for Reagan in 1984. or to criticize U.S. policy. And it was that kind of thing, this was new information that kind of went against their expectations that really had an impact. And as people who study the Soviet Union, propaganda is very nonlinear. It's very hard to predict how people are going to react. I have one anecdote. So I went to see the movie Wall Street in 1988 in Leningrad. And it's the moral rot of capitalism is depicted by Gordon Gekko leading this glamorous lifestyle as he's crushing these companies and engaging in all these illegal acts. So I went with a friend and we got out of the movie theater and I said, well, geez, I can understand why they showed that movie here. And he said, Tim, no, you don't understand. He said, when a Russian sees that movie, they think, oh God, I wish I could go there. I wish I could be Gordon Gekko. Right? So the propaganda works in very kind of non-linear ways. And we shouldn't overstate the ability of Russia to kind of push our buttons in that way. And that's important, I think, for a substantive reason, because I think we're also overstating Russia's trajectory if we cede to them the power to say that, oh God, look, when Americans get up in the morning, the first thing they think about is whether the Russians are hacking our email. And some people may with good reason, but there's lots of breathless commentary about Russia, about Putin as this master genius, that the country is back on the global stage, that it's this emerging power. But in a lot of ways, hacking is a weapon of the weak. Right? It can disrupt things, but if you're really a powerful country, you have a dynamic economy. Right? You have a powerful idea. You have leaders who can solve problems, and people around the world who say, "Geez, I wish my country was like that." And I don't think any of those things really describe the Russia that at least I know. And the reasons why Russia is gaining in prominence on the world stage is not so much because Russia's gaining in terms of soft power or hard power, but because the U.S. is in chaos and we're receding from important obligations that we had for a long time. So, and I think overstating Russia's capabilities right now is really doubly self-defeating because it diverts our attention from more pressing problems like North Korea, the long-term rise of China, the Middle East, but it also really plays into the Kremlin's narrative at home. You see, Russia really is a great power because, look, we're on the front page of the New York Times every day. And that is really news for the Kremlin. Okay, so those are my two overstatements. And then I have one which I think is an understatement. I think we're understating the risk of some kind of conflict or standoff between Russia and the United States. I think it's small because international conflict and crises are always small. But I think, one thing from political science, again with my political science hat on, is that conflicts don't usually start because one side or another wants them. They often start because of uncertainty. Right? And, Russia decision-making is very opaque. We really don't have a good idea about how the Kremlin would respond in a crisis situation. You saw the shoot down of the Russian jet that it violated Turkish airspace and how quickly that accelerated. So that there's a lot of uncertainty about how Russia would respond. There's also lots of uncertainty about how the U.S. would respond, right? I mean, what's really motivating Trump towards Russia? This is I don't think, I think the financial ties are a good story. If Trump really wanted to make money, he should be, though, buttering up the Chinese. I mean, it's hard to make money in Russia, right? It could be compromising material. We don't have evidence of that. It could be, just kind of straight collusion will help you in the election. That could come out. It could be his real penchant for dictators. He seems to really get along well with these guys. But it doesn't necessarily flow from that you would be so friendly to Russia, right? If you wanted to stick your chest out and take your shirt off and be a real tough guy, you probably would take a hard line towards Russia, not a soft line. So, I don't know which or any of these arguments are true, but I think there's enough, when you put them together, there's enough uncertainty about how the U.S. would respond and how, what U.S. motivations are, that if I was in Eastern Europe, for example, and, there was some crisis that took place, I would have a lot more doubt about how the U.S. would respond and how Russia would respond than I had, even just 2-3 years ago. So I think that is it's a low probability event, of course, but I think it's something that, we should keep on our radar screen. So thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. So this has been a fascinating discussion so far. To summarize, let me see if I can get this straight, what we've heard. Russia did something. They did it in part for reasons we're not sure, but probably included wanting to hurt Hillary Clinton. They did something, but we're not sure what its effect was. So it may have been something that mattered a lot. I'll just throw in a little bit more here, that in a super close election, anything can matter a lot, right? The weather that day can matter a lot. And, an FBI announcement can matter a lot. It gets really hard when you get into things that in terms of probabilities are coin flips in small numbers of states to sort of say what does or does not matter. But that goes both ways in the sense that for saying that if we think that what Russia is doing is actually something very weak, it may be in this particular case that a very weak stimuli was enough to just push something over the edge. It may not be. And while I agree with 95% of what Tim said in terms of this question about how hard it is to get people to change their viewpoints, there is this one thing that I would disagree about is I think the jury's still out on the extent to which social media exacerbates the tendencies for people to self-select into their own networks. I think the cable news network era, as compared to the evening news network era, it was a lot easier when we went into the era of Fox News, away from the era of Walter Cronkite, to self-select in. Social media, you get a lot of this inadvertent exposure. And when you combine that with this thing about what it is that people sticks in their head and what they remember, you may see things. People definitely saw things on social media that they didn't choose to see. Now, again, all those other questions remain from that. We've also, we've heard this powerful argument that social media has been weaponized, or cyber has been weaponized in some ways, right? But again, we're not sure what the power of that weapon is. So there's a lot of questions that I think this raises. I'm going to take my position here and sort of push on one question, pushing the panelists to look a little forward in this and to look a little bit past the election. And the question I want to ask is something I've actually been asking on panels like this for a while since the election, which is whether Russia is the dog that caught the car in this situation, right? And so this is a U.S. expression of the dog that's always chasing the car. But then the dog doesn't really know what to do with the car once it catches the car, right? It doesn't actually want to catch the car, it wants to chase the car. And so if we can take out of this a kind of consensus view that the Russians did something in this particular election to try to hurt Hillary Clinton, right? And to try to hurt the Clinton campaign. And we can bracket for a moment whether or not what they did, Facebook ad buys, tweets, trolls, actually had an effect in doing this. But there was some intent to hurt her. I think there's a consensus on that. I think there's a lot of people who think that this was probably done with the intention of weakening the Clinton presidency, and it's very easy, interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that particular way of just believing that the fix was in. I just thought, you had a lot of political scientists who said she was going to win anyway, right? So you didn't have to believe in conspiracy theories to think that Hillary Clinton was going to win, right? But regardless of this, something was done on the part of the Russians. And so the question I want to just ask the panelists is to sort of, for a moment, consider the alternative scenario, right? Let's imagine that the election had turned out in the opposite. Let's imagine that Trump wins the popular vote. Hillary Clinton is president. You have Donald Trump setting up a media company. Breitbart's been turned into a television station or something along those lines, right? And is, ratcheting, passing Fox. Fox is falling down and becoming the center-right network. You now have the far right, you have the Trump network to the right of Fox. He's spending every single day talking about how US elections are illegitimate. And the Russian case is now, well, maybe our elections have some flaws, but at least our guy got the most votes, right? In the United States, Trump got the most votes, and look, the fix is so in that Clinton is still president. Meanwhile, on foreign affairs, they have someone who's fairly predictable in the White House. They've had 8 years of Obama. They even had 4 years of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. Tim said this big thing, which is I've wrestled with since then, right? Why do we get into problems in international relations? What IR theory teaches us is uncertainty is what part of the problem is. And in fact, in strategic interactions, having an opponent in your interaction, or a partner, whatever you want to call it, and if you have no idea what they're going to do, that's a difficult situation, right? It's hard to plan for that. And so the Russians now are dealing with, not the least of which is this question of, now having gotten caught, what is the one piece of bipartisan legislation that's come out of Congress in the Trump era? It was making the sanctions worse and harder to get rid of them for the Russians, right? So if the goal was to improve the business climate, that doesn't seem to have happened, right? Now maybe that's incompetence, which goes back to this American fascination with thinking of Putin as the puppet master, right? And that, you know, I've even heard people, oh, he meant to get caught because he wants to send a signal, right? Well, if you wanted to get the sanctions lifted, I can imagine having, you know, having all these people who were more pro-Russia having to resign, having to step down. But even in the larger sense, right, people have said, well, you know, Trump, and I'm pushing on this, and I realize this is a bit of a contrarian viewpoint here, but even in a larger sense, well, you know, Trump is weakening U.S. commitments to international alliances, and that's opening up possibilities for Putin to drive wedges in. Okay, so it's maybe driving in wedges in the U.S.'s relations with Europe, but is Russia's real threat in the coming century from Europe? That there's going to be, that the Germans are going to be marching into Moscow again, right? In the meantime, you have North Korea, and they can't tell what Trump is going to do in this situation. They can't tell if this is going to lead to a shooting war in North Korea or worse. So I throw that out to you. Like, we've talked a lot about what may or may not have happened. We've talked a bit about what the consequences are within Russia, but I'm wondering about this question of, now in this world, if they had it all to do over again, right? Do you think that Putin really would want the Trump presidency with all it's entailed, or it would have been a sort of simpler world for none of that? Yeah, Julia.
So I'll answer with an anecdote. I happened to be in Moscow in April, early April, when the Trump administration fired 59 Tomahawk missiles into an empty airfield in Syria in retaliation for yet another chemical weapons strike. And the response in Moscow was just like, what the hell just happened? And I was on a TV show on TV Rain with Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry, and she wouldn't answer this on the air, but afterwards she kind of, I asked her, you know, so you guys, we have, I didn't say, okay, you got this, we now have this American president who talked all the time about respecting Russia, about being friends with Russia, about having a better relationship with Russia. And he is so unpredictable. Would it in some ways have been easier for you to deal with a Hillary Clinton who is, you know exactly what she is. She's very skeptical toward Putin, toward Russia. She's very hawkish. Would it have been easier? And she was like, well, you know, you guys pick your own thing. But she and then other people who are kind of close to the foreign ministry, the Kremlin, were like, yeah, okay, it would have been easier with Clinton. You know, like they were just, you know, because they did not expect it, right? They had 8 years of Obama hemming and hawing and paralysis by analysis, and then this guy just fires off 59 missiles. And I think it is very much the case of the dog caught the car, which speaks to the fat spider in the web and the you know, and the adhocracy and the fact that what Andrei said, which is that it's a tactical decision as opposed to a strategic decision, is this is what Putin tends to do. He makes these very quick, emotional, knee-jerk decisions, and you know, kind of non-voice, right? And then eventually the consequences catch up to him, and it turns out maybe, you know, I was also in Crimea this spring where they're going to run out of water really soon, and food prices have spiked, and the tourism industry has collapsed because it's hard to get, even if you fill every plane coming to Crimea, still not as much as tourists coming to Crimea as there were Ukrainians coming. And I was sitting with a group of Cossacks who had come out and protested in the Russian Spring in the, February of 2014 and had voted yes in the referendum, and were talking about how happy they were to have a national home, be home nationally. Then, you know, you kind of sit around and talk to them a little longer, and they're talking about how even though, you know, there's a Jewish conspiracy, blah, 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 they'd really like to either go back to Ukraine or become an autonomous republic and then join Israel, because even though it's full of Jews, at least as a law-abiding society, and they really, you know, we're having a really tough time under, you know, because the kind of violent, corrupt bureaucracy of Moscow had come to them, and they didn't really expect it. and you know, Crimea is now, as the Russians call it, a suitcase without a handle. You know, it's a nice suitcase, you don't want to throw it out, but it's kind of useless to you, you can't use it. And I think the Trump victory is a Pyrrhic victory that has burned out the fastest of all his more recent victories. As Medvedev noted on his Facebook page, now the sanctions, they were hoping that, you know, that they wouldn't react to them on Mike Flynn's promise, but now they're going to be with the Russians perhaps as long as Jackson Vanik was, and in part because of what the Russians did, in part because they were so flagrant and didn't care who noticed. That people noticed, and now there's hell to pay, and they're screwed.
Andre?
I just probably add one thing is in terms of consequences, it looks like the two most unhappy organizations with, in Moscow in terms of outcome of the elections are, surprisingly, the Foreign Ministry and the FSB. The Foreign Ministry lost so many people, sometimes literally. I mean, so many people died unexpectedly, and some of them we also lost our ambassador to UN. We lost our ambassador to the United States. All of them are extremely well connected here, and the replacements are not that good. The foreign minister also lost some facilities here. I mean, from New York to San Francisco. But to be honest, the FSB probably lost the most. Just remember that until 2015, maybe 16, the FSB enjoyed quite a good reputation here. Firstly, mostly because of the Boston bombings. And this story about Boston bombings and these apparent warnings issues.
Story of what?
The Boston
Boston
bombings.
bombing, the
bombings.
bombings in Boston, yeah.
In Boston, because the popular theory is that the FSB tried to warn twice or three times actually the U.S. government agencies and with some information about one of these guys, and that sort of helped to build the reputation of the FSB. Even after the annexation of Crimea, as far as I remember, it was April of 2015. The chief of the FSB was invited to DC to some counterterrorism conference, and even the chief of FBI was not invited. So Mr. Bortnikov enjoyed a very good reputation here. He was widely accepted, and nobody tried actually to put him on the list of sanctions. And it's all ended now. It's all finished. We have the very first time in the history of U.S. and Russian relationship, we have two guys from the FSB on the FBI wanted list. We have FSB people under arrest in Lefortovo prison, apparently because some people in the Kremlin got really nervous about the outcome of the elections. We also had a guy who was in charge of cyber hotline between Washington D.C. and Moscow, fired very silently without any kind of announcement. So the FSB suffered. So these people are not very happy. But unfortunately, it's not very good news, because here it's your area, it's area of political science, because it's a kind of we still see this thing about decline of institutions. So for many years, lots of people actually see that we have lots of things or functions shifting to the administration of the president. We still had some institutions like foreign ministry, the FSB, I mean interior ministry, all these ministries, but things are mostly decided at the administration of the president. And the immediate result of all these problems for the foreign ministry and the FSB, that the concentration of things outside of the administration of the president is getting bigger. And it means that things are much more unpredictable now. So I think that with the result with Hillary Clinton in the White House, even in Moscow, things will be much more predictable.
So just to add very quickly to that, so I think we know that Russia was a little shocked by the outcome of the election, the same way that people in the U.S. were, and we know that they did not expect Trump to win, and we know this because the Russian trolls were getting ready to roll out a campaign. I know you probably know this, on the night of the election with the hashtag democracy RIP. They expected Trump to lose, and they would have a huge campaign of how democracy is again defeated in the U.S. And as it turned out, the election went a completely different way. with the hilarious side effect that some people jumped the gun and started posting it too early, so that the editor of RT, for example, Margarita Simonyan, posted Democracy RIP just as Trump was winning. Hilariously enough, that tweet is still up there. So clearly, they did, in a way, run into the car. They didn't expect it. But in terms of whether they thought Trump would be more useful, I think they actually might have. And this goes to the mentality of the Russian leadership. They're so deeply cynical that they're unable to see how anybody else sees the world other than cynicism. I think, Josh, you alluded to this. In 2006, I was watching an interview with Putin, and they were asking him, why are you cracking down on your journalists? And he said, well, how's this any different from the US? You fired Dan Rather. Dan Rather was in trouble for some fake documents. And the journalist said, no, we didn't fire him. The president didn't fire Dan Rather. The network let him go. And Putin just went, yeah, sure. And I think this deep cynicism, because a cynic knows the price of everything and the value of nothing, this deep cynicism prevents Russia from truly understanding how the American system works. So I think in a way, believe it or not, Putin might have expected that Trump would act the way Putin would. In other words, maybe he would have been able to lift sanctions single-handedly. I don't think they get the American system because of that. And that's a limitation you'd think they want to avoid, but they can't overcome that being embedded in that deep, cynical worldview.
Yeah, just to be clear, just to be clear about that, the question wasn't, did they really want Clinton to win before the election? It was, should they have wanted Clinton? Right. Like,
Yes.
was this a mistake to have, regardless of whether it did? Yeah,
Yeah, I think
sorry,
that,
jump in.
you know,
Just to be clear.
Could someone else here ask a question that's based on the real strategic situation we're facing in
Yeah, we'll turn to the audience in a minute. Hold on. This is the pattern that we go.
It's disturbing to me because we have a limited amount of time with you guys, and you're going on and on with fantasy scenarios.
Okay.
Can we talk about what really is going on?
Thanks.
We'll just let the last speaker say, and then we'll turn
So,
to the audience.
yeah, I think, I mean, from my view is that the Russians did want Trump to win, and part of it is the timing of the first dump of data from the DNC, which happened, 20 minutes after the Access Hollywood tape? I mean, that suggests that they were paying attention and that they were very concerned that this was, I think they did think it was going to be a long shot, but my God, the payoff. You think of what Trump was promising and how far out of the mainstream that was of, any kind of strategic thinking towards Russia over the last 40 years. It's a long shot, but if the payoffs are big enough, it makes a lot of sense. But I do think that they did. That it is the example of the dog, catching the car, because they didn't expect to get caught, right? I mean, and they have got caught, and that now this has really ended any possibility for anything but the most tactical kinds of cooperation between U.S. and Russia. And Russia needs a good relations with the U.S. a lot more than the U.S. needs good relations with Russia. So I don't think that there's a very sophisticated understanding about how politics work in the United States, and that that this has really had a lot of bad blowback on Kremlin.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. Yes, sir.
Sure. So every speaker, I think, mentioned that this ad hoc approach to decision making in Russia, and I couldn't agree with that more. My concern with this generally reactive foreign policy is that while in the United States most people are still concerned about what Russia really did, there are many accusations, and some of them might come out true, some might not. Russia instead might use these accusations as a playbook, and even the thing that they didn't do the last time, they will do the next time. And so my question to everybody, maybe Andreas, as an expert on Russian security services, what would be the reason for them not to do it, not to expand their activities to the entire playbook that is suggested they did last time?
That's a very good question, but to be honest, I have no answer, because to me it looks like many things in this field are prompted by emotions. Sometimes it looks like the idea to interfere in some elections, for example in France, was just to show off. There was no any rationale to leak all documents just a day before the elections, because in France it was absolutely clear that these documents could not be used by French media. But nevertheless they did that, and there was no reason, but nevertheless they tried. In Germany, at the same time, they never tried to do this, which is a big mystery to me. So just to be honest, I do not want to be too speculative. I have no answer.
Okay. Yes.
I would just like to ask that the premise of all of you is that you restated it before you posed your scenario, that Russia did something, and then you just stated that they got caught. I would like to pose to everyone here that there is absolutely no proof that they got caught or that they did anything, and that if you listen to the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, William Binney and Ray McGovern, they have in fact posed, it couldn't have been a Russian hack. It's not, none of you must be IT experts. It's not feasible technologically to have accomplished that from remote hacking. And that this was an inside job, almost every American believes. I don't know where you guys live. I think Ivory Tower is an
I'm in Canada,
old-fashioned
so
expression.
Okay,
But
so
it's
thanks.
ridiculous, and I have a report that the VIPS
Can we take
report
that as
is
a comment?
available to you on in the public domain. They presented it to President Trump.
Okay, do you have a question to ask the panel?
And my question is, yeah, where do you live? And what are you desiring? Are you desiring World War III with Russia, the Cold War be revived, the things you hoped Hillary might have
Okay,
done?
thanks. Thank you very much
I
for your
don't get
question.
it. I don't know what your purpose is,
Well,
because it's all based on
okay,
law.
thanks very much. Yeah, Julia.
Thanks, yeah, great.
Answer the question.
Good question. There was no question.
I live in Manhattan.
The question is, what do you want? Do you want conflict
Clearly,
with
we all want
Russia?
Third World War. Can we
You
move
want
on,
a
please?
Cold War?
Yeah.
You
No,
want
come
a
on.
Cold War revived?
No, 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 no. We're trying to share
serious
people
now.
who've spent a lot of their lives learning about this
What do you
situation.
want? What do
Okay.
you want?
We're trying to provide analysis here. Okay, Julia.
So one of my takeaways from this great panel with lots of information is that there are two things going on in parallel. So Putin and others, of course, in Russia wanted to harm the Hillary campaign or Clinton campaign, but then also that Trump does have some deep ties with Russian financiers, oligarchs, and that in our minds, I guess we've kind of connected the two as related, but they might be unconnected. But I want to kind of circle back to the financial connections to Russia and the point that there's some consistency in Trump's behavior, attitude towards Russia. How should that be a concern? Why would we be concerned? How would that affect his behavior, or why should the U.S. be concerned about these deep financial ties?
Well, I'll be very quick because I don't want to repeat myself, but essentially, the roots of those collusion blossom into the kinds of financial exchanges that could lead to impeachable offenses, such as returning favors to Russian oligarchs.
But that would be good news for a liberal. Are there?
Presumably, yeah.
Is there bad news for a liberal?
Well, I don't know if I would see it through that prism. Good news, bad news for liberals. In general, there's no winners here in this analysis. But I would say it points to, if you're looking at sort of smoking guns in terms of actual collusion. Now, the roots of the collusion wouldn't really qualify because it has to be committed while in office. But things like, something like settling the Prevazan case, for example, that would be a kind of smoking gun that we would see if there was financial ties leading to favors being returned. We're getting in the realm of speculation, but I think it offers one more angle on the story.
I think that there's still, even though we know that Russia hacked the election and pretty much everyone who is sane agrees with this, there's still a lot we don't know. And even though I'm a committed journalist, I do get sick of this, and I do want to flip the clock forward 5 years to read, the Mueller report and just get to the end of the story. But I think there's still a lot we don't know, and a lot of these financial stories are very hard to report out and to find. It takes a lot of, and I think this is, I keep saying that 2017 is basically 2016, but with one candidate, where the media is just chasing every tweet and every stupid thing Trump says, as opposed to, and there are people doing this, but you do need a lot of focus and attention and patience to sit and dig through all this financial stuff and through all the shell companies that own shell companies that own shell companies. So right now we don't, in the public sphere, have a lot to go on. We know that Mueller is digging into this. But then there's also a lot of smoke and mirrors coming from the Trump people, like Felix Ater, who we saw up there. I actually decided to dig into this a little bit myself because Trump has been talking about wanting to build something in Russia for 30 years, and everybody and their mother has a hotel in Moscow, but Trump still does not. And I found that to be very curious, and in part it's because of a lack of connections and because he was using somebody like Felix Ater, who even is too sketchy even for the Russians, and was not able to build anything because also Russians are cynics, and it's really hard to, even when a Russian real estate developer says to you, like, I'm sorry, why are we paying for this Trump brand? It's not a management fee, it's not, Trump is a nothing brand here, we don't see why we should have to pay for it. So there's also, it's also hard to, what I'm trying to say is it's also very, very hard to parse through the bragging that you have on both sides, right? And there's also a lot of incompetence. You have, Michael Cohen trying to get this deal done during 2015, but when it stalls, he emails Peskov, the president's secretary, Putin's press secretary, asking, can you help us with the real estate deal, except he emails him at essentially press@kremlin.ru. It's like the generic email address he found on the website, which is, I don't know, is that and then you had channels like MSNBC run with it and say this is the most high-level connection to date, and so we have to, you have to cut through the bullshit on a lot of this, and it's very hard to do because there's so much noise and so much hysteria on both sides. It's hard.
There's a lot of stumbling around, I guess is how I would put it. When it comes to people like Manafort, who owed Deripaska, tens of millions of dollars, it's a lot more burn after reading, a lot less Day of the Condor, if you want to use sort of that kind of, it's a lot of people stumbling into things.
Yeah.
Stephen.
Can I just connect this conversation about potential collusion with the dog and the car? Sorry about metaphors here, but if the story is just the Russians were dumping a lot of information into social media and their information warriors were out there, that's not that big a news, right? That it worked is surprising, that they had access is surprising, but that they were doing it, both sides were doing it for 40 years, 50 years. So it worked on one side. The real issue was there receptive cooperation in terms of where to target the Facebook ads? Were they plugged into the data operations that the Trump campaign was running? Was there a connection to Flynn and presumable quid pro quos for after the election? Those are the real scenarios. And it seems to me that the side that knows this is sitting in the Kremlin. So if we are at a buyer's remorse moment, or if we get to a buyer's remorse moment for Putin and the regime, there is something they could do about it. And so my question is, do you ever see us getting to that point where they would pull the compromise?
So let me just push you one step further. Let's say they pull the compromise, be it, yes, he colluded with us, or yes, some prostitutes peed on each other in front of him, allegedly. Or both. Can you compromise a guy like Trump?
Yeah. Well,
I don't think you can.
No.
I don't think you can. He got elected president. I mean, compromise only works if there's remorse, right? If there's shame. He does not have either of those. He not only stayed in the race, but won after a tape came out of him bragging about sexual assault, and then a dozen women accused him very graphically of sexual assault, and he not only didn't quit, but he won. You can't. If I'm sitting in the Kremlin, I'm going to be like, God, we have all this good compromise for nothing.
No, but what you can do is you can hit fast forward on the Mueller report by that dump, right? We don't have to wait 5 years if, in fact, all the information finds its way to the investigators, in a 2 or 3 month period.
But it's not. Okay, but Mueller can't impeach him.
Right.
Republicans have to impeach him, and so far we're still at the level of like, oh, a Republican tweeted about his disappointment with Trump, but then went right back to voting with him.
So arguably could make, I'm sorry, but arguably could make it worse, because if that information gets out there and it doesn't do it, then he's inoculated against it.
Potentially.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay. We got lots of questions. Hands. Yes.
Is there anything to be learned from this about how the United States should or should not be influencing public opinion in other countries?
Could you repeat that question?
Is there anything that we can learn from this incident about how United States should or should not be influencing public opinion in other countries?
Having outed myself as an information warrior in the 1980s, I guess I have to answer that question. I mean, one difference is, you know, the U.S. civil society programs, you know, you can like them, you cannot like them. But, you know, they're a line item in the State Department budget. That's open. Everyone knows, you know, what's going on. I think, you know, the clandestine nature of, you know, the interference in the election, you know, that I think is of a different, you know, a different order. You know, there's a debate about, you know, the extent to which, you know, you should be proselytizing about your ideas and your values and whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. Again, there we really don't have a good sense of whether or not this actually has the effect that we want it to have. You know, there's lots of, you know, good research out there that, you know, our efforts to influence domestic politics in other countries doesn't always work out the way, you know, the White House would like it to. So, you know, I don't have any kind of definitive answer. But I do think there's a difference between doing it transparently and doing it in a
Maybe I can add only one thing is, in our book we describe it in detail, this monumental struggle between, say, Russian cyber officials and American cyber officials, how to talk about cyber. And it was always a big battle because the Russians always insisted of speaking in terms of information security. And the Americans and the British way have been always insisting on speaking in terms of cyber security, meaning that they wanted to talk only about cables and computers and systems, but not about content. And the Russians have been always insisting on talking about content. Why? Because it was about...
Louder, please.
It started in 1999, thanks to the war. We were in the war, and for the Kremlin, it was important to sell the Chechen war to the public, and the idea how to sell this war back then was to explain why we lost the first one. And the explanation of the Kremlin was that we lost the first Chechen war thanks to journalists, primarily foreign journalists. So that's why by 1999, by 2000, we needed a so-called doctrine of information security, and the idea, the concept of this document to say that in information space we have content which should be patrolled and protected against foreign media. The problem, I think I really uncomfortable right now because it looks like you are getting accepted with language. I mean, the Kremlin language of talking about these things. Nobody speaks about cyber warfare anymore. Everybody talking about information wars. And I think it's really, really dangerous. Maybe we need to find a way to stop talking about this in this terminology, because actually it's a very direct road to censorship. If you begin thinking about patrolling the content, even if you think that you're under immense information attack, it's extremely dangerous.
Yes.
I think you said the Russians hacked the election. Could you please be specific as to exactly what they did and what the evidence is for that?
So, we're back.
20 minutes.
So I would point you to the report that came out on January 6, 2017, with the unanimous opinion of the generally ununanimous American intelligence community speaking in high confidence about the role the Russians played in hacking the DNC, the DCCC, dumping that data at very strategic intervals with very specific goals. Pretty much anybody who has seen it's hard to talk about this stuff because a lot of this stuff is classified, right? And you get into this catch-22 of, well, if you can't talk about it, then it must not exist. But pretty much everybody who has seen the intelligence, including in real time.
And what was the evidence cited in the report?
That's part of the problem, is that it was a lot of it was classified, and we got a lot of the conclusions, but not the evidence.
So when you say that,
So I'm sorry, we're not going to get into
Sir,
a back and
please, these
forth.
people have given their time to come here. We don't need to harass, okay? Thanks very much. Yes, question.
would any of you care to speculate how Trump's policies towards Russia might have differed if it wasn't for all the investigations and speculation of collusion with the Russians on the hacking?
Sorry, repeat that.
How Trump's policies towards Russia might have differed if you had not had all of the investigations and speculation that Trump had colluded with the Russians.
Well, he doesn't really have a Russia policy right now. I think that's one of the things that's really puzzling most of Washington, which is where I live. He doesn't have a Russia policy to speak of. And I don't know that he really had much of a policy going into the election. You just had a long track record of him saying nice things about Putin and believing that Putin said nice things about him, including calling him a genius, which he did, in fact, did not do. But it's kind of, it doesn't matter what Putin said, it matters what Trump believes. So it was just a lot of like, they seem like a cool country, let's be friends. And he just kept talking in these the same way he talks about pretty much any other policy issue. He talks in these very grand, not even 30,000 foot, but like 60,000 foot terms of like, wouldn't it be great if we build a big beautiful wall, if we're friends with Russia, without kind of drilling down into what that actually means.
One, this is just counterfactual on this. If Trump had said, "No, look, I want to make Russia a priority," or "I want to, review the annexation of Crimea," or reevaluate our position with NATO, it would have been very interesting to see how Congress would have responded to that if we hadn't had all the mishigas around the hacking. Would they? That would be. We've seen them have a lot of backbone now, but it's easy to have backbone now because you have the interference scandal. Without that, would there have been more slippage? I don't know.
But there was, during the campaign, when he did kind of
there
say
was
these
some
things,
pushback,
there was a lot of pushback about calling NATO obsolete, about wanting to be friends with Russia for no reason, no tangible kind of strategic reason. There was a lot of pushback, but unfortunately, a lot of the pushback came from Democrats or from the kind of neocon wing of the Republican Party, which Trump very easily said, well, you gave us the Iraq War, thank you very much, and shut up.
So I'm going to take a question here from the live stream. We have an undergraduate student from Meg Lyons from Mercyhurst University who's asking, would it be helpful for the U.S. to have a program similar to the EU to inform the public on false media? Now we can debate that question, but to inform the public on information strategies, I guess, coming from Russia. So this goes back, I think, Andre, to the heart of your point, which is, and this goes into your question as well. I think it raises a bunch of different issues, which is if we are living in an environment now where, for technological reasons, it has become much, much easier for information to flow across borders, what are the responsibilities of states to be dealing with that information flow? And I think this is a huge question, right? This is a giant question because this goes back to, to Seva's point that we ended, right? That is the internet broken now? Do we suddenly see an unstoppable rise of states interfering in the free provision of information? And does this change because of borders? So I'll throw that question out to you guys. Because it's harder, it's much easier for information to flow across borders than it was previously.
Well, in a way, the biggest problem today, the biggest challenge for global internet is this idea of balkanization. Actually, I hate this term, but it means that lots of countries, especially in Europe, they believe, and it started some years ago after Snowden's revelations, that we need to have some borders on the internet. And of course with countries like China and Russia, it started long before Snowden, but basically it's the same idea. We need to have different kind of internets because we have different kind of cultures, we have our own understanding of democracy, and it all goes to the concept of digital sovereignty, which I think it's it's against the idea of the internet. Well, that's actually what the internet is all about, is to be part of something very, very big and global. I joined it, actually my first connection was about 1992. And I remember back then, I was 17 years old, in Moscow, sitting at some computer, that was the most freedom thing about the internet. Not that I can find some coffee shops on my street, or I can read something for free. The idea that I can be part of something global. So we need to think about that, not about how to install more borders or more regulation on the internet. It's not about that. the whole idea actually of why back in the 80s the idea of the United States was so appealing for the youth in Moscow, because it was global. It was all about the world. It was not about America. It was about the bigger concept. But we can be part of something bigger. That is which makes it so important and so appealing. We do not need to, we should remember about it.
Seven, if you want.
Yeah, just very quickly, I would add on to that. Yeah, the territorialization or Balkanization, whatever you want to call it, is proceeding apace, and this will only be another catalyst. I see it in trivial ways, just going from Canada to the US, things like Pandora or even Netflix. But I think we'll see expansion of territorial controls over the internet with the government control and with the help of Republicans and Democrats. I think they'll both be on this side in controlling of who has access when, where. I think that's part of a general trend that will only continue as a result of this.
Which I have to say is kind of, in many ways, a very Russian fix, right? You have a big complex problem, and what do, of any sort, and what do Russians do? Close it, ban it, forbid it, right? Push it out, box it in, throw it away. Whereas the actual issue here is much bigger, much more nebulous and harder to tackle, which is media literacy, education levels in America, social trust and trust in institutions, and whether or not institutions have earned those trust, the kind growing partisanship and tribalism in American politics, and the the polarization and radicalization of American politics. Again, Russia didn't create those, and Facebook certainly did not create those. Facebook may have accelerated those things, but I remember the thing that troubled me the most wasn't, during the 2016 election, wasn't the DNC hack and dump, which it came out immediately that it was a Russian operation, right? Even in the summer of 2016, but this project that the Wall Street Journal did called Red Feed, Blue Feed, where you could see in real time what kind of self-described liberals were seeing on Facebook and what self-described conservatives were seeing on Facebook. And really it was a Venn diagram that was just two separate circles over here. I mean, and because I live in the mainstream media world, for lack of a better term, looking at the red feed, I was like, I don't even know what these names are, what these events that they're referring to are. And I'm a journalist, right? And traveling around the country, what people said was, where they get their information, which was YouTube and Facebook and word of mouth. Because they don't trust the media, and the kind of the crazy things that they were repeating to me, and the less reasonable, the more believable they were, and that's not going to be fixed by a congressional act, requiring Facebook to do something or getting Russia Today to register under FARA, which is pointless and just opens us up for retribution.
Yeah, ignorance about politics is not new, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of people have believed a lot of crazy things for a long time. I mean, the real problem is efforts to betray our ideals. Chin up, chest out, America.
Yeah.
We've got good institutions. We've got freedom of speech. People like this. It's good. It's good. It's much better than the alternative. And when we turn our backs on that, I don't think it really serves our interests.
Question back here. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is about the rise of anti-establishment far-right parties in Europe and how that relates to Russian support, which goes before the U.S. election and extends to today. And sort of we've talked about this decentralized support, but I think with regards to the U.S. election, but I think it's been more centralized with supporting these far-right parties, especially on RT and Sputnik in the German election, and as you guys alluded to, financial support for the National Front. So is this out of ideological symbiosis between Russia and the far right, or is this more of a strategic vision that Russia has about weakening the EU and sowing division in general?
Take that? So there is some ideological affinity, but not that much, because how else do you explain that they will support literally anybody? They will support, in the French election there were 4 candidates and Russia was betting on 3 of them, right? It is to weaken NATO, to weaken the transatlantic alliance, to weaken the EU. I mean, the first thing that Russians were asking about, for example, when there was talk of a Brexit during the Greek financial collapse, was, are they going to lift sanctions? First question when Brexit happened was, are they going to lift sanctions? They're talking much more kind of small bore things. And if you watch Russia Today, they support the far left and the far right. And in the 2016 election, they supported Bernie Sanders and they supported Donald Trump until Bernie was out of the race. And then they, kept playing on the paranoias and fears of Bernie supporters that he was cheated and that this was all kind of rigged for Hillary. So it's really anything but the status quo to make the whole thing more shaky, right? It's not a positive program. It's, you bring the U.S. or Europe down a few pegs, and then like the scales will be a little bit more different. You're not trying to raise yourself up. The other thing is our role and like the policy decisions that were made in Washington and Brussels that and London that accelerated the rise of these parties. So, for example, I'll give you again an anecdotal example. At the time, I was talking to an Obama administration State Department official who had been pushing, was a long-time Democrat, was pushing for a long time for some kind of intervention in Syria early on when it was more feasible. And then in the summer of 2015, when the refugee flows became just out of control and started overwhelming Europe, and you started seeing this backlash in Europe, that was not driven, maybe Russia was kind of fanning the flames on the edges, but this was pretty organic. And I remember talking to this official again, and he said, when I was trying to lay out for the Obama White House how bad things could get, I knew things would get very bad if we didn't do something in Syria, but I didn't know that we'd lose Europe as a result. So a lot of this stuff is because of problems endemic to the EU, right? The fact that the EU is this weird compromise thing that after having existed for a couple decades, it starts running up against its own natural limitations. But of course Russia is happy to get involved, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were like spamming the Spanish, in Catalan, right? But that doesn't mean that they created the problem. I think that we have to think again about how we created these things.
I just wanted to recommend you a very good book which was just published in the US and UK. It's Anton Shekhovtsov, and one of the best scholars in this field. He just published a book called Russia and the Western Far Right. It's a really good book, and he's a very good scholar. But basically, what I think is important here is it looks to me that it's mostly about tactical things, but not about ideology. Why? Because in Russia we have at least two guys who were seeking for years to be in charge of this kind of ideology. And both of them, Dugin and Yakunin, were sort of in decline, and one of them was dismissed, and he is somewhere between Moscow and Berlin doing almost nothing. Another one, Dugin, he's absolutely insignificant. So I think that tells you something about how important this kind of ideology for the Kremlin.
And ideology, ideology, we're not dealing with an ideological Russia. This isn't the Soviet Union. There is no core ideology, right? There is an ideology that Putin finds useful in a very cynical way at whatever moment, right? So from 2000 to basically 2008, it was just get rich, right? And we have no ideology whatsoever. After 2012, when he came back for a third term, it's a very deeply anti-liberal, conservative kind of Slavophilic or pan-Slavic ideology. But I have no doubt that will be shucked or thrown into the trash the second he finds a better or more convenient ideology. There is he is the ultimate cynic, and the people around him and the people who are the kind of the ballast of the state, especially the people who were born in the 60s, are so deeply cynical. There is nothing they believe.
I think there's also a second order effect of undermining the idea of democracy, which is the effect it has on the Russian public at home. When the EU looks bad and the US looks bad, it's much more difficult in Russia to say, yeah, we really want elections. Boy, they're really a great thing, aren't they? Anything that achieves that goal, I think, is something that is very useful for the Kremlin. I don't know, I wouldn't say that's the first order effect, but I do think it does have definitely, you just see it when you go there and talk with people.
And that's the very Surkov kind of very
Yeah,
cynical
yeah.
postmodern approach, right? There's no truth,
right.
there's no good or bad, there's nothing's better, no one thing is better than the other thing, right? And so if our system is no worse than the American system and their system is no better than ours, then why don't you play for your own team? Why do you want to be on the other team?
So let me just push on that a little bit. We have a question here from Michael Marsh-Soloway, who's the director of the Global Studio at the University of Richmond, who's watching on the live stream. And his question was similar to this about ideology, but instead of pushing it about the affinity between the far right and the Russian government in terms of ideology, was asking a question about whether the conflict between the US and Russia at this point was fundamentally ideological in nature, as it was portrayed to be during the Cold War, or it had a different characteristic now. Now, based on the answers we've just had to the last question, I'm going to sort of pump that and say, okay, so we think it's not fundamentally ideological. But his follow-up question was, so how does that change the rules of this conflict that we find the US and Russia in right now from the sort of more ideologically based conflict that was there during the Cold War? And to push on this a little bit, just to bring it tied into a couple of the other questions that have been asked, has this changed? I think things changed a lot after Crimea, but has this changed since 2016? Are there different rules of engagement right now? And are we, I guess I would push a little bit and just sort of say, if there's a tendency to look back and sort of nostalgize the Cold War and think, oh, this is how the Soviet Union and the West struggled through proxies and through these kinds of things, is that going to give us sort of a bad understanding of the way this current conflict is unfolding for either technological reasons or because of this evolution of the sort of non-ideological dimension of a conflict that maybe previously was ideological? Zeva?
Well, so I'll disagree a little bit with the premise. Putin may be cynical, postmodern, pragmatic, whatever you want to call it, but the conflict is ideological. In part, whether Putin wants it to be or not, it has already become ideological. So yes, it's absolutely true. There's no ideological consistency in Russian foreign policy. I would describe it as paranoid pragmatism, which sounds odd because the two don't really usually go together, but it's paranoid in the sense they're afraid of the worst possible scenario and they'll do anything to avoid that. That's the pragmatic part. But in doing so, they've become ideological enemies of the U.S. And if the U.S. considers you an ideological enemy, it doesn't matter that you're postmodern, you're an ideological enemy. And that's the way the conflict is playing out. Now the problem is, if anybody saw the documentary Fog of War by Robert McNamara, where he says, look, the reason we failed in Vietnam is we failed to empathize with the Viet Cong. Empathize not in the sense of sympathy, but understanding where they're coming from. And there's a real danger of that happening in the U.S.-Russian relationship right now, because people in the U.S., even policymakers in the U.S., generally, I would say, don't have a good sense of where Russian policymakers are coming from. And part of where they're coming from is paranoia. We can talk about whether it's justifiable paranoia or not, given Russian history. But I think there's a real chance being missed here in establishing some common ground, because the conflict is quickly turning ideological, despite the wishes of both sides. I'm afraid it's not going to get better. We can't end on that.
Well, I'll push you just a little bit back on that, Zeva, which is to say, we are speaking, we've said this a number of times in the last half an hour or so, that the U.S. feels this, the U.S. feels that, the U.S. is treating it this way. We've talked a bit about how the pyramid with the tentacles, right? Maybe for the Russian foreign policy making regime, but what do we mean now when we say the U.S. feels this, right? Do we mean the President of the United States? Do we mean the military in the United States? Do we mean the Congress of the United States? Again, I'll go back to the fact where, a regime that set out to get sanctions, that thought they had a real shot, and from watching the campaign rhetoric, we would have thought you had a real shot. And, we've all heard various and sundry rumors that I was, at a conference in January, and I heard rumors the first thing that was going to happen on January 28th, there was a date, the sanctions were going to be lifted. So we think this got close. But now we've ended up, the one show of bipartisanship in the US Congress has been to vote to make these sanctions more stringent and hard to remove. So when we talk about the US here, are we talking about, what are we talking about when we say the US views this as an ideological conflict?
Yeah, so let's use a very amorphous and unsatisfying, but probably appropriate term here, which is the US foreign policy establishment.
Okay.
Okay, now we can parse that, and I think that's probably unproductive in the 10 minutes we have left.
Right.
But I think that's the general consensus. And of course, part of Trump's appeal is that he was pushing against that establishment consensus.
So I agree. I think that they were going to lift sanctions, but Mike Flynn lied to Mike Pence, and he got fired. And apparently as late as the day after Flynn's firing, Flynn's deputy was, or one of his deputies was kind of feebly pushing to get the sanctions pulled from, there was a National Security Council meeting, and he was like, should we just lift the sanctions? And he got a lot of pushback, like, okay, if we do that, what do we get for that? Or what would the point of that be? And he was just kind of like, I don't know, I'm just kind of doing this, right? So it had been kind of, the effort had been decapitated. And it seemed, you're right, in December, when one of the last things President Obama did was to implement these sanctions, I remember thinking at the time, well, these are going to be the most short-lived sanctions in US history. But because of what Russia did and because of the fingerprints they left, I think sometimes wittingly, to kind of like the way that the FSB breaks into the homes of foreign correspondents and diplomats in Moscow and like steals their rugs or leaves a trace in the toilet, which has actually happened to a friend of mine. They want you to know that they did it, right? But unfortunately, what for them is the very national security foreign policy establishment that they were trying to circumvent and bypass by going through Flynn and Jared Kushner and Trump has come roaring back, and it has. I think that was the kind of the scariest thing watching from that establishment in Washington, watching the campaign, was that these issues had for so long, for decades, been of bipartisan consensus. It was like one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agreed on was NATO, was the transatlantic alliance, was all these kind of fuzzy-wuzzy things that Trump was just one after the other, just, killing. And because of what the Russians did, it kind of, now the national security and foreign policy establishment, which is deeply suspicious of Russia and antagonistic toward Russia, is now ruling the roost again. And very much the case in Washington.
There's one kind of dangerous moment here from, again, I'll pull the political psychology card, where in these kind of interactions between countries, we tend to explain the other side's behavior by their innate being. Putin behaves the way he is because that's the kind of guy he is. And then we explain our own behavior because, hey, look at the situation we're in. Look at my incentives. Look at the pressures I had. I had to make this kind of decision. And that's a hard thing to break out of. And it's especially hard in, this paranoid pragmatist, where even small efforts at cooperation are seen as attempts to, tear at the edges of, the kind of political economic system in Russia in ways that, I don't think, Americans or Europeans who are proposing, even simple things like, military-to-military contacts or new kinds of discussions. I think that, they're just treated very, very skeptically. So the general problem, I think it's exacerbated by this, particular administration in the Kremlin.
Do we have any more questions? All right, then please join me in thanking the panelists for extremely